3-Minute Math with Mr. White. In this video, we're going to cover how to use the quadratic formula to solve quadratic equations. This is something that always works. All you have to do is plug in the right numbers in the right place and work it out correctly, and you can find the solution to any quadratic equation. So this is the example we're going to actually work here in a bit. Our goal here is to figure out what x would go in there and work, and there's actually two answers. So the quadratic formula will give us two answers. Before we actually tackle that problem, we need to know what the quadratic formula is. Now, given an equation ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, where a, b, and c are some numbers, our answers will be, here comes the plug and chug formula, the opposite of b. So you take that b, change the sign. The opposite of b plus or minus giant square root. Now, underneath that square root in the discriminant area is going to be b squared. So we got to square whatever that b is, minus 4 times a. Now, a is that leading coefficient out there I have in red, times c. C is the constant at the end. So you have b squared minus 4 times a times c, all under that square root, and that's called the discriminant. And all of that over 2 times a, whatever a is. That is called the quadratic formula. The answers are x equals opposite of b plus or minus the giant square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. By the way, I don't like to say minus 4ac. I like to think about that as negative 4 times a times c, as you'll see here in a second. Now, I did mention earlier we get two answers, and those are going to come from the plus and minus that is part of this formula. So that's where we generate these two solutions. Let's get back to our example, x squared plus 6x minus 7. First thing we want to do is identify what a is. A is 1. B is the number in front of the x, which is 6, and then c is your constant. In this particular example, it is negative 7. So let's bring the formula back up, and now we're going to start plugging things in. So for example, the opposite of b, so we have to put that 6 in for b. So we're going to put it in there, and now we have the opposite of 6, which of course is negative 6. Plus or minus giant square root of, now we got to put the b, which is 6, in for that b squared segment. So we're going to end up with 6 squared. Now we're going to take our a equals 1 and we're going to put it in for a. So we have minus 4 times 1. And now we're going to take our c, which is negative 7, put it in for c, and we get minus 4 times 1 times negative 7, all over 2 times. Well, here we go again. We got to put that 1 in for a. So we put our 1 in right there. Now let's move this up a bit so we can now simplify and get our two answers. First thing we do is just rewrite it in minus 6 or negative 6 plus or minus giant square root. We're going to focus under that radical. Again, that area is called the discriminant. It actually has a name. And we're going to start with 6 squared, and of course that's 36. Now the next portion is negative 4 times 1 times negative 7. Now a negative times a positive times a negative is a positive. Now just take 4 times 1 times 7. That's 28. All over 2 times 1, which is 2. Okay, now we're going to focus on simplifying underneath that radical. The 36 plus the 28 is 64. And now always check, just maybe you have a perfect square. The square root of 64 actually is plain old 8, so we can go ahead and simplify that. So now we have the statement negative 6 plus or minus 8 all over 2. Now remember, that plus or minus is how we're going to get our two answers. So we're going to branch that off at this point and get negative 6 plus 8 over 2 and negative 6 minus 8 over 2. Negative 6 plus 8 over 2, of course, is 2 over 2, which is 1. And then negative 6 minus 8 over 2 is negative 14 over 2, which is negative 7. So there's our two answers to the original question. What would x be if x squared plus 6x minus 7 equals 0? And the answers are x equals 1 and x equals negative 7. So this was a primer on how to use the quadratic formula to solve a quadratic equation. We could have done this using a completing the square method or a factoring method and gotten the same answers, but here's the thing, is you can't always factor an equation. You can always use the quadratic formula though to get your answers. Now sometimes you get imaginary answers, imaginary numbers if you're familiar with that, but the quadratic formula can be incredibly useful and you definitely want to memorize it. All right, this has been 3-Minute Math with Mr. White.